Let the mayhem begin.
Up to this point, I've reviewed films that I either love or could do without. But this review will be an unusual one for me, in that I'm reviewing a film that's widely regarded as a weak film. I've seen reviews that called it the worst in the series. Even Pierce Brosnan has called it the worst of his films. Yet, because of either nostalgic value or some other reason, I still enjoy the film very much. Here I'll break down the good and bad of the film to see if common reviews are exaggerations, or if this film is just a guilty pleasure for me. This film started some trends in the next few Bond films. First, the filmmakers apparently felt the desire to shoehorn popular American actresses of the time as the Bond girls, none of whom were as interesting or classy as Holly Goodhead or Pam Bouvier. Second, these films repeat the main plots of many of the previous ones. Rip-off! Lastly, the complex characterization in the previous three films is significantly pulled back, which, interestingly, coincides with the death of producer Albert Broccoli, who had started it. Now, I've been asked whether I think less of these three films by comparison to the previous ones. Not necessarily. The repeat in plots and the understated characterizations somewhat emulate the early films, almost like a return to form. They even include a score by David Arnold that emulates the days of John Barry. Whether these trends work or not, however, should be taken on a movie-by-movie basis. So, back to tomorrow. I guess I'll start with the complaints that everyone else seems to have that I actually agree with. This movie depicts a media baron, Elliot Carver, who intends to start a war between Britain and China by staging attacks on each country's fleet. Yep, it's just like You Only Live Twice and The Spy Who Loved Me, only this film doesn't take into account Cold War politics. There are a number of problems with this particular plot, which also apply to the films that this one copies. Once Bond knows who's responsible and has evidence to prove it, shouldn't the conflict between the two countries subside? I know it's more complicated than that, and I guess in The Spy Who Loved Me it didn't really work that way, but it should start some discussion between the two governments, or something. But guess what? That actually happens in this movie. Wait a minute, when does that happen in this movie?
Tell the fleet to search for a ship that's invisible, well, almost invisible to radar. The Chinese aren't the enemy. Carver's been playing both sides for fools.
Before the climax? Talk about undercutting the exciting conclusion. It seems that this film's greatest virtue, the action scenes, continue to further diminish the impact of the climax, particularly the pre-title sequence, which I think is the best action set piece of the movie. Bond's alone, doing reconnaissance on a terrorist camp, when the British Navy decides to take it out with a missile. Little do they know, there's a nuclear bomb in the camp that would likely cause a nuclear disaster if the missile hit. So it's up to Bond to get the nuke out of the camp without getting killed by the army of terrorists before the missile gets there. Now that's a climax. But there's only one problem. It's at the beginning of the movie. In most of the films, Bond faces the impossible odds at the end of the film, making the ending that much more satisfying. But this great scene almost gives Bond a get-out-of-jail-free card by expending the danger at the beginning. Another major weakness of the film is the secondary Bond girl, Paris Carver, who contributes to the character subplot of this film. With her character, we get something we don't normally see. What would happen if Bond sees a Bond girl after he's left her to go on his next mission? We also learn that she managed to get under Bond's skin, and he fell in love with her. Unfortunately, Terry Hatcher's performance kills any interest in the character. In fact, many of her scenes had to be cut because of it. Hatcher is one of the few Bond girl actresses that said that she got nothing out of the experience, and that the only reason she did it was because her husband always wanted to be with a Bond girl. Great. The simple fact that Paris is severely underdeveloped makes her character less believable. In the other films, where Bond fell in love with the Bond girl, I could usually see why he fell for her. In this case, Paris not only doesn't have any favorable traits other than looks, she has traits that make her unfavorable. She's a bit snobby, she's a liar, and she's prone to cheating. I think if the filmmakers went with their original plan of having Natalia from GoldenEye be the character, it would have been a lot better. We wouldn't need the additional scenes to like her character, because most fans would still remember all the cool stuff she did in GoldenEye. Brosnan was particularly critical of the filmmakers' choice to cast Hatcher, and believed that they made a mistake by not hiring Monica Bellucci, who had also auditioned for the role. Now to the things that didn't bother me, but seemed to bother everyone else. Bond's very first line, where he calls smoking a filthy habit. Fans criticized this line because they thought it too PC, and that it was against the character of Bond, who was prone to smoking many packs a day. But seriously, come on. He was making a joke. Or you could say he was just speaking from experience if you want to get technical. In general, people complained about the puns in this film. I know it's subjective, but there was only one that really stood out to me as bad.
You'll have to admit, though, we seem to have developed a certain attachment to each other.
Another criticism that bothered people was the copious use of product placement. Given that product placement has been a staple of the Bond series since 1953, that is, in the Fleming novels, this shouldn't have been too much of an issue. Then again, I suppose it was kind of ridiculous having British Range Rovers chase a German BMW motorcycle in Vietnam.
So much for German efficiency.
Lastly, during the car chase, Bond's windows get damaged by gunfire, despite the fact that they were shown as practically impervious to anything earlier. This is a valid criticism, but I guess it's just too brief to bother me. Maybe they didn't want to use the big guns because they didn't want to damage the encoder? Now that I've gone over the weaknesses of the film, let's talk about the cool stuff. I know I'll get a lot of criticism for this, but Elliot Carver is one of my favorite villains. He has a quote that sums up the Bond villains really well.
The distance between insanity and genius is measured only by success.
Part of what really sells the character for me is the masterful performance by Jonathan Pryce. I especially like his way of promoting the New World Order surrounded by technological advancement.
You see, we're both men of action, but your era and Miss Lynn's is passing. Words are the new weapons. Satellites, the new artillery.
And you become the new Supreme Allied Commander?
Exactly.
He really encouraged further contrast between himself and Bond. A lot of people call Carver a weak villain, but he does the obligatory kill my own henchman thing, and for this movie, that boosts him in my book. Michelle Yeoh is great as the main Bond girl, Wei Lin. She played off Brosnan really well, and we see the similar methods the two characters use to attain their goal. In fact, the producers liked Yeoh so much that she almost returned in Die Another Day. She even gets to do her kung fu thing, which is always a lot of fun. That said, she does fall into the class of Bond girl that would have worked better as an ally to Bond rather than a lover. It's unfortunate that the writers felt the need to have her get kidnapped twice in the climax just so we can have a forced romance at the end. It's not as bad as what we'll see in the next film, thankfully. There were a lot of neat bits too.
Send this thing off to the launch site, and be careful. It's worth $300 million. You break it, you bought it. Understand?
Bond fakes out the bad guys with a dead body, making it look like the villains got him. Bond and Wei Lin fall down a banner of Carvers Face, which was performed by Brosnan and Yeoh, by the way. Bond's scene with Dr. Kaufman might be my favorite scene. We had Kaufman's dark humor and simultaneous professionalism to contrast an uncommon intensity by Brosnan's Bond. This might be the darkest kill in his films. Lastly, there were neat and, importantly, subtle homages to the previous films in the series. Baiting the bad guy using a key word, going for something quickly to bait the henchman, familiar locales towards the end of the film, and cutting something away when fighting the blonde tough guy. In the end, I think this film is just a fun movie. It doesn't evoke any depth as it falls into the action over substance category, but I think that's what it was intended to do. It doesn't diminish my enjoyment of the film at all. We get generally good performances from the lead characters and tons of action to distract us from the bad ones. I will say, however, that if every Bond film featured Bond going Rambo, like he does in this film, it'd be a very dull series. But it does work as an occasional detour that, if not done too over the top, adds welcome variety to the series. I'm so glad they didn't do this.